Clara Hayes collapsed in the mud outside her own infirmary, vomit streaking down her chin, fever burning through her blood. 4 patients dead, 13 more dying. The whole valley had turned against her, torches blazing in the midnight darkness. They called her a murderer, a snake, said she brought nothing but death. But just 3 weeks earlier, she had stepped off that train with nothing but a worn carpetbag and a dream of healing. This is the story of how a mail-order bride in rags saved an entire valley from deliberate murder, or died trying. Sometimes the most precious gifts come wrapped in the plainest paper. Clara Hayes, 24 years old, learned this truth the moment she stepped onto the platform at Millfield Depot with a patched calico dress and a worn carpetbag. But inside that bag was something that would save an entire valley, or get her accused of murder. The morning train wheezed to a stop, releasing a cloud of steam that hung in the still Texas air like morning mist over a lake. 5 women stepped onto the wooden platform, their skirts rustling against weathered planks that had seen 1,000 arrivals, but few as desperate as these. The scent of coal smoke mixed with prairie grass carried on a gentle breeze that promised another scorching June day in 1882. 4 women wore silk dresses with matching parasols, their hair pinned in elaborate styles beneath feathered hats that probably cost more than Clara had earned in a year. They positioned themselves like peacocks on display, turning this way and that to catch the light to show their finest angles. Each one knew what she represented: beauty, refinement, a good investment for any man with means. The 5th woman clutched her worn carpet bag with both hands, feeling the familiar weight of her father's medical instruments shift inside. Her blue calico dress had been carefully patched at the elbows with thread that nearly matched, but the effort only drew attention to the poverty it tried to hide. No feathered hat for Clara Hayes, no silk parasol to shield her from the sun that had already begun to freckle her nose and cheeks. She did not belong here. The thought pressed against her chest like a physical weight, making it hard to breathe. These women were here to be chosen, to be deemed worthy, to begin new lives with men who could afford to order a bride through the mail like a piece of furniture or a set of dishes. Clara had answered the advertisement in desperation, not hope. When you have nothing left, even the plainest wrapping starts to look like opportunity. William Brennan stood beside his bogey at the far end of the platform, his weathered hands resting on the leather traces. The town's wealthiest rancher, the biggest spread in 3 counties. Every unmarried woman within 100 miles had set her cap for him over the years, and everyone had been quietly, politely refused. Now he stood motionless, watching the train disgorge its cargo of hope and desperation. His face revealed nothing. Not interest, not disappointment, just the careful observation of a man who had learned to trust his instincts more than his desires. The 4 silk dresses began their parade. The 1st woman, a redhead with porcelain skin and a practiced smile, stepped forward with just enough hesitation to seem modest, while ensuring every eye followed her movement. She tilted her parasol at the perfect angle to shade her face while highlighting the curve of her neck. William Brennan did not move. The 2nd woman, blonde and younger than the others, tried a different approach. She laughed the sound like wind chimes and gestured to something amusing in the distance. "See how pleasant I am," the gesture said. "See how I will brighten your home with joy." William Brennan shifted his weight from one foot to the other. Nothing more. The 3rd and 4th women exchanged glances, then tried together, moving as a pair, creating a vision of feminine grace and companionship. 2 for the price of 1, perhaps. Or at least proof that they could coexist peacefully, that whoever was chosen would not bring drama or discord. William Brennan looked past them all. His eyes found Clara. She wanted to look away, wanted to blend into the platform's wooden planks, to become invisible, to spare herself the humiliation of being seen in all her poverty and plainness. But something in his gaze held her pinned like a butterfly to a board. Not cruel, not mocking, just seeing her in a way that made her throat tight. He walked toward her with the slow, deliberate steps of a man who had already made his decision and saw no reason to rush. Each footfall echoed against the platform. The silk dresses turned to watch their perfect smiles beginning to crack at the edges. William stopped 3 feet from Clara, close enough that she could see the gray threaded through his dark hair, the fine lines around his eyes from squinting into too many sunrises. Close enough to smell leather and horse and something else. Pine soap, maybe. He stood 6'3", broad-shouldered, with the hands that looked like they had built half the county themselves. His voice, when he finally spoke, carried the roughness of a man more comfortable with cattle than conversation. "You got medicine in that bag?" Clara blinked. Of all the questions she had prepared herself to answer, this was not one of them. She glanced down at her carpet bag, worn leather soft from years of used corners, reinforced with careful stitching. Inside, wrapped in cloth, to prevent rattling, were her father's instruments: scalpels and forceps, vials of laudanum and quinine, packets of herbs her grandmother had taught her to identify before she could read. "I do," she said. Her voice came out steadier than she felt. "Folks on the train took fever. Couldn't just watch them suffer." Something flickered in William Brennan's eyes. Recognition, maybe, or approval. He gave a single nod, sharp as a hammer striking an anvil. "My buggy's over there," he said. "You'll ride with me." The platform erupted in whispers. The silk dresses clustered together, their shock giving way to outrage. One of them, the redhead, found her voice first. "Sir, there must be some mistake. Surely you meant to—" William did not turn around. "No mistake," he said. Clara's fingers tightened on her bag. This was not how she had imagined it would go. In her mind, there had been interviews, questions about her skills with a needle or a stove, assessments of her ability to manage a household, to bear children, to be pleasing and agreeable and useful. She had prepared answers to all those unspoken questions. She had not prepared for a man who wanted her for her medicine. The buggy ride away from Millfield Depot felt like traveling through a painting. The road wound through grassland that stretched to the horizon in every direction, broken only by the occasional cottonwood tree or rocky outcropping. The sky arched overhead, so blue it hurt to look at, so vast it made Clara feel smaller than she had ever felt in her 24 years. William sat beside her, one hand loose on the reins, saying nothing. The silence was not uncomfortable exactly, just complete, like he had used up his quota of words for the day and saw no reason to waste more on small talk. Clara filled the quiet by watching the land, by counting the cattle scattered across the grassland like dark seeds against gold, by noting the way the earth changed color as they climbed the long hill that overlooked what she assumed was Brennan land. When they crested the rise, she understood why he had said nothing. Words would have been inadequate. The ranch spread below them like a kingdom. Thousands of acres of rolling grassland, a two-story house with a wraparound porch, barns and corrals and outbuildings arranged with the kind of order that spoke of a man who thought in systems and efficiency, in long-term planning. In the distance, mountains rose purple against the horizon. "Biggest spread in 3 counties," William said. It was a statement of fact, not a boast. The difference mattered. Clara counted the men working near the corrals. 12, maybe 15. Cowboys moving slower than they should in the morning coolness, even though the sun had barely begun its climb toward punishing heat. She watched one lean heavy against a fence post, his face pale beneath his hat brim, despite the gentle temperature. "That fellow's poorly," she said, pointing. William's jaw tightened. "You can see that from here. Look at how he's standing, weight all on one side. And watch when he moves." They rode closer. The cowhand they passed had yellow crescents under each nail, visible even from the buggy. His gums, when he spat into the dust, showed pale as old bone. Another man stumbled slightly while carrying a water bucket, catching himself on the corral rail with a grunt that spoke of weakness he was trying to hide. Clara's stomach clenched. She had seen this before on the wagon trains heading west. Men who worked hard but ate wrong, their bodies slowly consuming themselves from the inside. "They got the scurvy," she said. "That one too." She nodded toward a thin cowhand whose lips had cracked at the corners like old leather. He moved with the careful stiffness of someone whose joints ached, whose bones felt like they were grinding together with each step. William pulled the buggy to a stop beside the house. Wild roses climbed the porch posts, their sweet perfume mixing with the earthy smell of the kitchen garden. He helped her down, his calloused palm rough but gentle against her fingers. For a moment their eyes met, and Clara saw something there she had not expected. Desperation. A man with the biggest spread in 3 counties, wealthy enough to order any bride he wanted, should not look desperate. But William Brennan did, just for that fraction of a second before he looked away. "What do they need?" he asked. Clara walked to where vegetables grew behind the house. Wild onions pushed through rich soil near the fence, their green shoots bright against brown earth. She knelt and pinched one between her thumb and forefinger, breathing the sharp scent that made her eyes water slightly. "Beans and beef ain't enough." she said, standing and brushing dirt from her skirt. The soil left dark crescents under her own fingernails, marks that made her hands look like they belonged to the cowboys she had just diagnosed. They need fresh greens, or you'll lose half your crew before winter comes. William's boots shifted in the gravel, scraping like grinding stones. He studied her for a long moment, his weathered face unreadable in the morning light. Then he gave another of those sharp nods. Tell me what to do. That evening, kerosene lamplight flickered across the kitchen table, casting dancing shadows on the whitewashed walls. The smell of coal oil mixed with coffee grounds and leftover bacon grease, creating the particular perfume of frontier domesticity. Clara spread brown wrapping paper flat across the scarred wooden surface and sketched rough lines with a pencil stub worn smooth by use. A small room, she said, her pencil marking where walls would go. Shelves along one side for medicines and supplies. A window facing east for morning light. Nothing fancy. Just somewhere to tend folks proper when they take sick. She drew quickly, efficiently, the way her father had taught her to think through problems. Start with the essentials. Add comfort only after function is secured. She had watched him work in field hospitals during the war, had seen him save men with nothing but clean water and determination and a willingness to try when everyone else had given up. William stood at her shoulder close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from his body. He studied the drawing the way a general might study a map before a battle. We could fix up that storage room off the barn, he said. His voice carried quiet certainty, like he had already been thinking along the same lines, and her sketch just confirmed what he already knew. Clara nodded, relief washing through her. She had half expected resistance. Questions about cost, about propriety, about whether it was appropriate for an unmarried woman to be treating men she barely knew. Instead, William Brennan saw the problem and the solution in the same breath. She added details to the sketch. A work table for mixing medicines. Hooks for hanging drying herbs. A small stove for heating water and brewing teas. Higher on that end, she said, when he began describing where the medicine shelf would go. William adjusted without question, trusting her judgment in this as completely as she had trusted his judgment about the land when they first arrived. The pencil moved across the paper, and Clara felt something shift in her chest, a loosening of the tight knot that had lived there since her father died, since she had sold everything she owned to pay his debts, since she had found herself alone with nothing but a carpet bag full of medical instruments and the fading echo of his voice telling her that healing was the highest calling, the most sacred trust. Why the word came out harder than William had intended, hanging in the still air between them like a challenge. Clara set down the pencil. She had expected this question eventually, expected to have to justify her presumption, her boldness in suggesting changes to a ranch she had been on for less than a day. She looked directly at him, meeting his gaze without flinching. Her next words balanced on the edge of everything that would follow. But before she could speak, hoofbeats thundered into the yard. Someone riding hard in the darkness, shouting words that would change everything they had planned. The rider's horse skidded to a halt outside the kitchen window, foam flecking its muzzle white in the lamplight. Dust swirled through the yellow glow as boots hit the ground, hard, the impact speaking of urgency that could not wait for proper dismounting. Mr. Brennan. The voice cracked with fear, barely held in check. Got trouble at the Henderson place. Their boy's burning up with fever. Can't keep nothing down. William pushed back from the table, his chair scraping against wooden floorboards. The sound echoed in the sudden silence, loud as a gunshot. Clara folded the brown paper carefully, her hands steady despite the sudden spike of adrenaline. She knew this feeling, had felt it 100 times in her father's practice. The call that comes after dark, the desperate family, the child who cannot afford to wait until morning. How long's the child been sick? She asked through the open window. The rider was Tommy Miller from town, barely 16, his face slick with sweat despite the cooling night air. He wiped his forehead with a trembling hand. 3 days, ma'am. Can't keep nothing down. Mrs. Henderson's beside herself with worry. Clara's fingers worked quickly, untying her apron strings. The familiar weight of responsibility settled across her shoulders like an old shawl, comfortable and suffocating in equal measure. She grabbed her carpet bag from where it sat by the door, checking by feel that everything was still in place. Glass vials that could not be allowed to break, cloth packets of herbs, her father's scalpel clean and sharp. Tell her we're coming, she said. The buggy ride to town passed in tense silence except for wheels grinding over packed earth and the steady clip-clop of hooves eating up the miles. Clara clutched her carpet bag tight, feeling the dried herbs shift inside their cloth bundles. She ran through possibilities in her mind. 3 days of fever, unable to keep food down. That could be anything from simple stomach distress to something far worse. The night air carried the scent of cooling grass and distant wood smoke from kitchen stoves being banked for the evening. Stars wheeled overhead in their ancient patterns, indifferent to the small human dramas playing out beneath them. The same stars that had looked down on her father's battlefield hospitals. The same stars that would still be there long after she was gone. Henderson's house sat at the end of Main Street lamplight, glowing warm in every window, like a beacon of hope or a warning of disaster. Mary Henderson met them at the gate before William could even set the brake. Her gray hair hung loose around her shoulders, uncovered improper. Dark circles shadowed her eyes, speaking of nights without sleep, of watching and waiting and praying for help that might come too late. "Thank the Lord you've come," she whispered, gripping Clara's arm with desperate fingers. Her hands felt hot, trembling. "Tommy's been calling for his papa, but his papa's been dead these 2 years." Clara followed Mary up the front steps, their footsteps echoing hollow on the wooden porch. The house smelled of carbolic soap and something else underneath it, the sour scent of sickness, sharp and unmistakable. It made her stomach clench with recognition and dread in equal measure. Tommy Henderson lay in a narrow bed near the kitchen stove, positioned there to keep him warm, even though warmth was the last thing his body needed right now. His small form twisted in damp sheets, 12 years old, but looking half that size in his extremity. Fever blazed from his skin like heat from a forge, and his breathing came in quick, shallow gasps that barely moved his chest. Clara pressed her palm to the boy's forehead. The heat shocked her, hot enough to drain a grown man, let alone a child. She lifted his eyelids with gentle fingers, noting how his pupils had shrunk to pinpoints despite the dim room. "Fetch me a basin of cool water," she said to Mary, "and clean cloths, lots of them." While Mary bustled about gathering supplies, Clara opened her carpet bag and selected her medicines by touch alone. Willow bark for the fever, slippery elm for his damaged throat, chamomile to help him rest. Her grandmother's voice whispered in her memory, "Measure twice, give once. A mistake can kill as sure as the sickness." She ground willow bark to powder using Mary's wooden spoon and mixing bowl. The bitter scent rose sharp in the warm kitchen air. She mixed it with honey and a splash of water, forming a paste thin enough to swallow, but thick enough to stay down. Her hands moved with practiced efficiency, muscle memory, taking over where conscious thought might falter. Tommy's eyes fluttered open when Clara touched the spoon to his cracked lips. For a moment, he focused on her face with the clarity that sometimes comes before the end, the terrible brief lucidity that lets a dying person say goodbye. "Are you an angel?" he whispered, his voice no stronger than autumn leaves skittering across a porch. "Just a woman with some medicine," Clara replied, keeping her voice gentle, steady. "Swallow if you can, child." The boy's throat worked weakly, managing to take down 3 small spoonfuls before his strength gave out. Clara wrapped cool, wet cloths around his wrists and ankles, places where blood flowed close to the skin, where cooling would spread fastest through his burning body. She worked with quiet concentration, aware of Mary Henderson sitting in a straight-backed chair beside the bed, hands twisted in her apron like she was wringing wash. "Will he live?" Clara wrung out another cloth in the basin, the cool water running between her fingers. The truth sat heavy on her tongue. She did not know, could not know. Fever this high could cook, a brain could damage organs beyond repair, could simply burn through a body until there was nothing left but a husk. "We'll know by morning," she said instead. "Fever's got to break before it does permanent harm." She worked through the night, changing cloths as they warmed against Tommy's skin, spooning medicine between his lips every hour, measuring time by the kitchen clock that ticked loud in the silence, marking seconds like a funeral march. Checking his pulse against her wrist, feeling the rapid flutter of his heart, working too hard, pumping blood through a system that was slowly cooking itself from the inside. Mary dozed fitfully in her chair, exhausted from 3 nights of solitary vigil. Her head would drop, then jerk back up, her eyes searching for her son, confirming he still breathed, before sleep claimed her again for another few minutes. Near dawn, Tommy's breathing deepened. The terrible heat radiating from his small body began to ease degree by precious degree. Sweat beaded on his forehead, the first good sign Clara had seen. His body's desperate attempt to cool itself to find equilibrium to choose life over the easier path of letting go. Clara stepped onto the front porch as the eastern sky lightened from black to gray to the pale blue that promised another scorching day. The morning air felt cool against her face, a blessing after hours in the overheated kitchen. Roosters crowed from backyard coops. Smoke began to rise from kitchen chimneys as the town stirred to life, unaware that in this small house, a battle had been fought and tentatively won. Behind her, Tommy Henderson slept peacefully for the first time in days. His fever had broken just as the sun touched the horizon, leaving him weak, but breathing easy, his pulse steadier, his skin merely warm instead of blazing. Mary had wept with relief, pressing Clara's hands to her wet cheeks in wordless gratitude. But as Clara watched the sunrise paint the eastern mountains gold, she noticed something that made her blood run cold despite her exhaustion. Dust clouds on the horizon. Not one rider this time, but several wagons approaching fast from different directions, all converging on the town where word would spread quickly about the woman who had brought a dying child back from the edge of the grave. How many more were coming, and how many could she possibly save? The question hung in the morning air, unanswered and unanswerable. Clara gripped the porch railing with both hands, feeling splinters bite into her palms. She was so tired, bone-tired, soul-tired, the kind of exhaustion that came from holding another person's life in your hands and knowing that one wrong move, one miscalculation, one moment of inattention could tip the scales toward death. William appeared at her elbow, silent as a shadow. He had spent the night in Henderson's barn, giving the women privacy, but close enough to help if needed. Now he stood beside her, following her gaze to the approaching dust clouds. "Word travels fast," he said. "Too fast," Claire replied. The first wagon arrived at Brennan Ranch before the morning dew had dried from the grass. Clara watched from the kitchen window as the Pattersons from Willow Creek climbed down from their buckboard, their faces grim with worry. Mrs. Patterson carried a bundle wrapped in quilts, another child burning with the same fever that had nearly killed Tommy Henderson. "That storage room," Clara asked, already moving toward the door. William nodded toward the barn. 3 days of hard work had transformed the dusty space into something resembling a proper sick room, though calling it proper was generous. Pine boards lined the walls, still smelling of fresh sawdust and lye soap. Sunlight streamed through the enlarged window painting, squares of gold across the whitewashed floor. The sound of hammering had filled those 3 days while Tommy Henderson recovered in his mother's house. William measuring boards twice before cutting his calloused hands, working the saw with patient strokes that sent wood shavings curling to the ground like nature's confetti. Clara had sorted dried herbs while he worked, filling glass mason jars with carefully measured portions of willow bark, echinacea, slippery elm. "Higher on that end," she had said, when he mounted the medicine shelf, her voice carrying quiet certainty that made him adjust the board without question. Now the converted room held 3 narrow beds with fresh straw mattresses. Shelves lined with bottles and jars stood ready. A work table waited for mixing medicines. The sharp scent of carbolic acid lingered from Clara's thorough cleaning, mixing with the earthy smell of new lumber. Rosa Delgado, the ranch cook, appeared in the doorway with an armful of dried plants. The Mexican woman had worked for William for a decade, and her knowledge of local herbs ran deep as the roots she harvested. "For the fever," Rosa said in Spanish-accented English, laying out bundles of unfamiliar plants. "My grandmother used these. They grow only in the high country." Charlie Patterson carried his daughter Emma through the door. 8 years old, red hair like her mother, face flushed red as summer roses. The child's breathing came in quick gasps, and her eyes rolled back, showing only whites. Clara guided them to the first bed, noting how Emma's skin blazed with heat even through her cotton nightgown. "Started yesterday morning," Mrs. Patterson said, her voice tight with controlled panic. "Same fever that took the Morrison boy over in Cedar Valley." Clara's hands stilled on Emma's forehead. "Morrison boy died 3 days ago. His mama's half crazy with grief." The news hit like cold water. Clara had assumed, perhaps foolishly, that Tommy Henderson's recovery meant she understood this sickness. That willow bark and cool cloths would be enough. That her father's training and her grandmother's herb lore would let her save any child placed in her care. But if children were dying despite treatment, then this was something different, something worse. More wagons appeared throughout the morning. The Millers brought their youngest son, burning with fever, and calling for his dead grandfather in a voice that made Clara's skin crawl. Old Henrik Larson arrived alone, his weathered face gray with illness, barely able to sit upright in his cart seat. By noon, Clara had 6 patients in beds meant for 3. She moved between them like a dancer following well-worn steps, checking temperatures, spooning medicine between cracked lips, changing sweat-soaked bedding, wringing out cloths in basins of cool water, until her hands grew raw and wrinkled. The work was endless, exhausting, a battle fought one patient at a time with no guarantee of victory. William appeared at her elbow, carrying fresh water from the well, the bucket handle cutting red marks into his palms. "Need more beds," he said. "Need more hands, too," Claire replied, wiping Emma Patterson's face with a damp cloth. The little girl's fever had not responded to willow bark tea the way Tommy's had. Her breathing grew more labored with each hour, each breath requiring visible effort that made her small chest work like a bellows. Clara watched her with growing dread, recognizing the signs. The way the fever climbed despite treatment, the way the body seemed to be consuming itself from the inside. The afternoon heat climbed past 100 degrees, turning the infirmary into an oven despite the open windows. Clara's dress clung to her back with sweat. Her legs shook from exhaustion. She had been working for 18 hours with only snatches of rest between patients. Dr. Miller arrived from Sweetwater just as the sun touched the western mountains. The elderly physician climbed down from his buggy, with obvious effort, his medical bag clutched in trembling hands. His face looked haggard, eyes sunken deep in their sockets, like a man who had seen too much death and not enough life. "Heard you've been treating the fever," he said, wiping sweat from his forehead despite the evening cool. Clara nodded toward the infirmary. 6 patients, 3 children. Dr. Miller's shoulders sagged under the weight of knowledge he did not want to share. "Lost 4 yesterday in Sweetwater," he said. "2 more today." The words hung between them like a death sentence. Clara felt her throat close, her vision narrow. 4 dead yesterday, 2 today. And here she was with 6 patients, 3 of them children, all burning with the same fever that had killed those others. "What you using for treatment?" Miller asked. "Willow bark for fever, cool compresses, liquids when they can keep him down." Dr. Miller looked toward the infirmary lamplight already glowing in the windows as evening fell. His expression held grim resignation, the look of a man who had fought this battle before and knew how it would end. "Same as me," he said. "Sometimes it works, sometimes it don't." They walked together toward the infirmary, their footsteps echoing hollow on the wooden walkway William had built between house and barn. Night sounds began to fill the air. Crickets chirping in the grass, cattle lowing in distant pastures. The soft murmur of families gathered around sickbeds praying for miracles that might not come. Inside the infirmary, patients lay in various stages of illness. Emma Patterson thrashed in fever dreams, calling for her mother in a voice thin as paper. The Miller boy stared at the ceiling, with glassy eyes, his lips moving in silent conversation with invisible visitors. Henrik Larsson's breathing had grown shallow and quick, each breath a visible struggle against the weight pressing down on his chest. Dr. Miller moved from bed to bed, his weathered hands gentle, as he checked pulses and listened to labored breathing. Clara watched his face grow more grave with each examination. When he finished, he looked toward the window where darkness pressed against the glass. In the distance, more lights approached, lanterns and torches marking the arrival of additional families seeking help. "This ain't ordinary fever," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "What do you mean?" Dr. Miller turned to face her, his eyes reflecting the lamplight like mirrors that had seen too much. "Been doctoring 40 years. Never seen sickness spread this fast. Hit this hard." He paused, weighing his next words. "And never seen it strike multiple valleys at the same time." Clara's stomach clenched. Multiple valleys? Got word from Cedar Creek, Pine Ridge, and Sweetwater, all reporting the same thing. Sudden outbreak, high fever, children dying faster than adults. Dr. Miller's voice cracked on the last words, and Clara understood. This was not just medical curiosity speaking. This was a man who had held dying children in his arms, who had watched their mothers weep, who had signed death certificates knowing he had failed to save them. "Something's poisoning the water supply," he said. The implications crashed over Clara like a breaking dam. If the water was contaminated, then every well, every stream, every source people used for drinking carried death in its depths. And if it had spread to multiple valleys covering distances that would take days to travel, then this was not accident or natural disaster. This was deliberate. A new sound reached them through the open window, the distant thunder of approaching hoofbeats, but wrong somehow. Too many horses moving too fast for families bringing their sick. More like riders with a specific destination and deadly purpose moving with military precision through the darkness. Dr. Miller's hand moved instinctively toward the door. Company coming, and they ain't bringing patience. Marshal Webb emerged from the darkness like a ghost made flesh. 6 men on lathered horses, their badges glinting in the lamplight that spilled from the infirmary windows. The lead rider swung down from his saddle with the careful movements of a man who had been riding hard for days, his joints protesting every motion. Marshal Webb, he said, tipping his hat to Clara. Territorial office sent us to investigate the water situation. Dr. Miller stepped forward, his medical bag clutched tight in both hands. What water situation? Marshal Webb's weathered face looked grim in the flickering light. Sweat stains darkened his shirt despite the cool night air. Dust coated his clothes like flowers, speaking of long miles ridden without rest. He removed his hat, running fingers through gray hair that stuck to his scalp with perspiration. 5 valleys reporting the same outbreak, he said. Started 2 weeks ago in Pine Ridge. Spread east from there. Clara's breath caught in her throat. How many dead? 23 so far. Mostly children and old folks. Webb's jaw tightened. But here's what's got headquarters worried. The pattern's too regular, too organized. William emerged from the house carrying a pot of coffee steam rising from the spout in the cool air. What kind of pattern? Webb accepted a cup with hands that trembled slightly from exhaustion. The hot coffee seemed to steady him as he spoke, as if the warmth was the first comfort he had felt in days. It hits the highest elevation valley first, then spreads downstream. Always follows the same water sources, like someone planned it, like someone studied how water flows through these mountains and timed it perfect. Clara felt ice form in her stomach despite the summer heat lingering in the evening air. You saying someone's poisoning the water on purpose? That's what we aim to find out, Webb said. He drained his coffee cup and handed it back to William. Need to examine your water sources come daylight. Test them proper. The marshal's men made camp in the ranch yard, their horses tied to the corral fence with weary heads hanging low. Clara returned to the infirmary where her patients lay in various stages of fever. Emma Patterson's breathing had grown more labored. Each breath required visible effort that made her small chest work like a bellows fighting against impossible weight. Dawn would bring answers, Marshal Webb had promised. Dawn would bring tests and examinations, and maybe finally understanding of what was killing these children. But dawn felt very far away, and Emma Patterson's breathing grew weaker with each passing hour. Dawn brought scorching heat that pressed down like a wool blanket over the valley. The thermometer on the porch read 98 degrees before the sun cleared the mountains, promising another day that would climb past 110. Clara carried water buckets from the well, noting how the metal handle burned her palms even through her work gloves. Marshal Webb and his men examined every water source on Brennan property. The main well, the stock tanks, the creek that ran along the eastern boundary, its water clear and cold as it tumbled over smooth stones. They collected samples in glass bottles, sealing each with wax and careful labels written in precise script that would mean something to territorial officials in faraway offices. Water tastes fine, Webb said, wiping his mouth after sampling from the well. But poison don't always have a flavor. Clara watched them work, her own hands busy with the endless task of nursing. Emma Patterson's fever had climbed higher during the night, and the child now lay unconscious, her skin burning hot as a stove lid. Cool cloths did nothing to bring down the terrible heat radiating from her small body. It was as if something inside the girl was consuming her from within, feeding on her flesh to sustain its own dark purpose. The morning brought new patients. 3 cowhands from the Lazy K Ranch arrived in a buckboard, their faces flushed red with fever and their eyes bright with delirium. One called constantly for his mother, though he was 30 years old if he was a day. Another stared at the ceiling, carrying on animated conversations with invisible companions about cattle drives that happened 20 years ago. The third simply shook, his whole body trembling like a leaf in a storm. By noon, Clara had 12 patients crowded into space meant for 6. Mattresses covered the infirmary floor. The smell of sweat and sickness hung thick in the superheated air, a physical presence that made breathing an effort. She moved between beds like a woman walking underwater, each step requiring tremendous effort as the heat sapped her strength like a vampire drawing blood. William appeared at her elbow with a cup of water that felt blessedly cool against her cracked lips. "You're working yourself to death," he said. "Can't stop," Claire replied. She wiped sweat from her forehead with a damp cloth that was already warm from her skin. "Emma's getting worse. And that cowhand from Lazy K." She looked toward Pete Hawkins, 58 years old, a man who had survived 3 decades of hard ranch work only to be laid low by something he could not see or fight. He lay still as death, except for the barely visible rise and fall of his chest. His weathered face had gone gray, the color of old ashes. Dr. Miller appeared in the doorway, swaying slightly on his feet. His face was flushed, his eyes too bright. Clara recognized the signs immediately because she was beginning to feel them herself. The faint tremor in her hands, the way food turned to sand in her mouth, the creeping weakness that started in her legs and spread upward like rising water. They were infected, both of them, the healers falling victim to the same plague they were trying to cure. Marshall Webb returned from examining the upstream water sources, his face grim beneath the brim of his hat. Sweat had carved channels through the dust on his cheeks. His shirt stuck to his back with dark stains that spoke of exertion and punishing heat. Inside the house, he spread a hand-drawn map across the wooden table, his fingers leaving damp prints on the paper. "Found something," he said. The map showed the creek system that fed their valley branches and tributaries marked in blue ink. Red X marks indicated locations along the waterway, each one labeled with a date written in careful script. The pattern was unmistakable once you knew to look for it. "Started here," Webb said, pointing to the highest X. "Dead sheep in the water. Been there maybe 2 weeks, judging by the state of the carcass." His finger moved to marks lower on the creek, following the water's natural flow downhill. "But look at this. More dead animals at regular intervals all the way down to your property line. A cow here, another sheep there. A horse that looks like it was shot and dumped in on purpose." Clara studied the pattern, her tired mind struggling to make sense of what she was seeing. The X marks formed an almost perfect line following the water's flow. Too perfect to be coincidence. Too precise to be natural. "Animals don't die that regular," she said. "No, ma'am, they don't." Webb rolled up the map with hands that shook slightly. "Someone's been placing dead animals in the water supply, timing it so the poison reaches each valley in sequence, calculating how long it takes for contaminated water to flow from one settlement to the next." The implication struck Clara like a physical blow. Not an accident or natural disaster, not even simple negligence or stupidity, but deliberate murder carried out with methodical precision. Someone had planned the death of entire communities, had sat down with maps and calculations, and worked out exactly how to kill hundreds of people while making it look like natural causes. William's jaw tightened, his hands curled into fists on the table, knuckles going white with the force of his grip. "Who would do such a thing? That's what we aim to find out," Webb said. He tucked the map inside his vest pocket, close to his heart where it would be safe. "But whoever's behind this, they know these mountains better than most. Know the water systems, the timing, how fast news travels between valleys." As evening approached, Clara noticed something that made her skin crawl with dread. The sickest patients had stopped responding to her treatments entirely. Emma Patterson, old Henrik Larson, two of the Lazy K cowhands. Their fevers climbed higher despite willow bark tea and cool compresses. Their breathing grew more labored with each passing hour, each breath a battle that they were slowly losing. She was failing them. All her knowledge, all her determination, all her desperate efforts were proving inadequate against whatever poison flowed through their water. Her father's training meant nothing. Her grandmother's herb lore was useless. She was watching people die, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. But as darkness fell and lamplight flickered through the infirmary windows, Marshall Webb brought news that made her blood run cold. "Just got word by telegraph," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "The next valley downstream, Cottonwood Creek. They started taking sick this morning." Clara's hands stilled on Emma Patterson's fevered brow. If the pattern held, if the poison continued its methodical spread down the water system, then every community from here to the territorial capital would face the same outbreak. Hundreds of families, thousands of people, and all drinking from water sources that carried death in their depths. But what chilled her most was Webb's final words. And we just lost contact with our telegraph operator in Millfield. Line went dead an hour ago. Someone was cutting their communications, isolating each valley as the sickness spread, which meant whoever was behind the poisonings was still out there, still active, moving closer to Brennan Ranch with each passing hour. And they knew exactly what they were doing. Emma Patterson died at sunrise. Clara knelt beside the small bed, her palm pressed to the child's still chest, feeling for any flutter of life that might remain. A heartbeat, a breath, any sign that the battle was not yet lost. But there was nothing. The little girl's heart had stopped sometime before dawn, while Clara dozed fitfully in a chair, her body finally demanding the rest her will denied. Mrs. Patterson sat rigid on a wooden stool, her hands twisted in her apron until her knuckles showed white as bone. Her eyes had taken on a glassy sheen, bright with fever, that had claimed her during the night. "She's just sleeping," Rachel Patterson whispered in a sing-song voice that raised gooseflesh on Clara's arms. "My Emma's finally sleeping peaceful." Clara pulled a clean sheet over Emma's face, her hands trembling as she tucked the corners smooth. The child's mother had taken fever during the night, her eyes now bright with delirium that painted false comfort over unbearable loss. She would not accept her daughter's death, could not accept it. The truth was too terrible to bear, so her fevered mind simply refused to acknowledge it. The infirmary door creaked open. William entered carrying fresh water, the bucket handle cutting red marks into his palms. Behind him came more families, desperate faces carrying bundles wrapped in quilts, seeking help from the only person who had shown any ability to heal. By noon, Clara counted 17 patients in space meant for 6. Mattresses covered every inch of floor. The smell of sickness hung thick in the stifling heat. She moved between beds like a woman walking through molasses, each step requiring tremendous effort as her own strength ebbed like water draining from a cracked vessel. Pete Hawkins thrashed in the corner, bed his weathered hands clawing at empty air as if fighting invisible demons. "Maria," he called out, his voice cracking like old leather. "Don't drink the water, Maria. Something's wrong with the water." Clara spooned willow bark tea between his cracked lips, watching most of it dribble down his stubbled chin. The medicine that had saved Tommy Henderson seemed powerless against whatever poison flowed through their valley's water system. She wanted to scream at the unfairness of it, wanted to demand answers from a God who would let children die while evil men prospered in their distant offices. Her own hands shook as she wrung out cloths in basins of cool water. The tremor had started that morning, a fine quiver in her fingers that spread up her arms like ripples on a pond. She recognized the early signs from tending other patients. Weakness, sweating despite the shade, the way food turned to sand in her mouth, impossible to swallow. She was infected. The realization settled in her chest like a cold stone, but she pushed it aside. 17 people depended on her. Dr. Miller had collapsed that morning, burning with fever and talking to his dead wife about their wedding day. There was no one else with even her limited knowledge of healing. No one else willing to stay when any sane person would run. Marshall Webb appeared at her elbow, his face grim beneath the brim of his dusty hat. "Doc Miller's taken sick," he said. "Found him this morning in his wagon, burning with fever, calling out names of patients he lost 30 years ago." Clara's legs nearly buckled. Dr. Miller had been her only source of real medical knowledge, the one person who might understand what they faced, the one ally who knew enough to help. "Where is he?" "In his wagon outside. Too weak to stand." Webb removed his hat, running fingers through gray hair, sticky with sweat. "That makes 18 patients, and you the only one still on your feet." The afternoon heat climbed past 108 degrees, turning the infirmary into an oven that baked the smell of sweat and sickness into the wooden walls. Clara's dress clung to her back, soaked through with perspiration that carried the salt taste of exhaustion on her lips. Her vision blurred at the edges. Twice she had to grip a bedpost to keep from falling, her legs refusing to support her weight. 3 more patients arrived as the sun touched the western mountains. The Hendersons brought their youngest daughter, Sarah, barely 5 years old, her small body burning with the same fever that had nearly killed her brother Tommy. Mary Henderson wept as she laid the child on the last available mattress, her tears falling hot on Clara's hands. "Tommy got better," she said, gripping Clara's wrist with desperate fingers. "Tell me little Sarah will get better too." Clara looked down at the child, noting the telltale signs. Flushed skin hot as forged coals, breathing quick and shallow. Lips cracked despite attempts to force water between them. The same symptoms that had killed Emma Patterson just hours before. "We'll do everything we can," Clara said. Her voice came out as a rasp. Her throat had swollen nearly shut, making each word an effort that sent pains shooting through her chest. She tasted blood where the tender tissue had torn. Night fell like a black blanket over the ranch. Clara moved between beds by lamplight, checking pulses that fluttered like trapped birds, spooning medicine between lips that burned with fever. Her vision swam. The room tilted. She gripped the wall to stay upright, breathing hard through her nose because her throat had closed too much for air to pass easily. William found her collapsed beside Henrik Larsson's bed, at midnight, her head resting on the old rancher's still chest. Henrik had died sometime during the evening, his breathing growing shallower and shallower until it stopped entirely while Clara tended other patients. "That's four," William said, helping her to a chair that felt like salvation under her trembling legs. Clara wiped vomit from her lips with the back of her hand tasting bile and blood where her throat had torn from retching. 13 still alive," she whispered. "Have to keep trying. You can barely stand. Can't stop." Clara tried to rise and fell back into the chair, her legs refusing to support her weight. "Sarah Henderson's getting worse. And that cowhand from Lazy K." She looked toward Pete Hawkins. His breathing came in gasps so shallow they barely moved the blanket covering his chest. The infirmary door opened, letting in cool night air that felt like a blessing against Clara's fevered skin. Marshal Webb entered with news written clear on his haggard face. "Telegraph line to Territorial Capital went dead an hour ago," he said. "We're cut off complete now." Clara's vision swam as the implications hit her. No communication meant no help coming from outside, no fresh supplies, no additional doctors, no cavalry riding to their rescue, just her failing strength against an epidemic that showed no signs of slowing. "There's more," Webb continued, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "Found fresh horse tracks near the creek. Maybe 6 riders. Someone's been watching us." The words sent ice through Clara's fever-heated blood. While she had been fighting to save lives, someone had been observing their struggle from the shadows. Counting the dead, perhaps. Or waiting for the perfect moment to finish what the poisoned water had started. A new sound drifted through the open window. The distant rhythm of approaching hoofbeats, but wrong somehow. Too many horses moving too fast for families bringing their sick. More like riders with a specific destination and deadly purpose. Webb's hand moved instinctively to his gun belt. "Company coming, and they ain't bringing patience." Clara struggled to stand, her legs shaking like autumn leaves. Through the window, she could see torches moving through the darkness. At least a dozen riders approaching the ranch with military precision, who rode in formation after midnight, carrying torches like they meant to burn something down. Clara's knees buckled as she reached for the infirmary door. The wooden planks rushed up to meet her impact, sending shockwaves through bones that felt hollow as bird wings. But she crawled the final 3 feet to grasp the door handle with fingers that shook like leaves in a storm. The riders reined their horses 20 yards from the infirmary torchlight, painting their faces in harsh angles of shadow and flame. Not outlaws or night riders. These men wore clean clothes and carried themselves with the authority of town officials. Banker Morrison sat his horse at their center, his pressed suit somehow still pristine despite the midnight hour. Mrs. Brennan Morrison called out, his voice carrying the sharp edge of a man accustomed to obedience. "We need to discuss this situation." Clara hauled herself upright, using the door frame, leaving sweaty handprints on the whitewashed wood. Her legs trembled beneath her, threatening to dump her back into the dirt where she belonged. Behind her, the infirmary reeked of death and failure. 4 bodies covered with sheets. 13 more sliding toward the same fate. "Now ain't the time," William said, stepping between the delegation and Clara's wavering form. "It's exactly the time." Morrison's horse pranced sideways, hooves striking sparks from stone. 4 dead in 2 days. More dying every hour. Maybe it's time to let nature take its course instead of prolonging the suffering. Clara tried to speak and managed only a wet wheeze. Her throat had closed almost completely, swollen shut like a strangled animal's. She opened her mouth again, desperate to defend her efforts, but only bloody spittle emerged to streak down her chin. "She's in over her head," Preacher William said from atop a bay gelding. "Playing doctor when she ought to be praying." The words hit Clara like physical blows. She doubled over, retching thin bile that splattered across her boots and mixed with the dust to form a foul-smelling mud. The acidic liquid burned her raw throat, bringing tears that she wiped away with the back of her trembling hand. More riders materialized from the darkness. Families who had brought their sick to her just days before now, sitting their horses with faces carved from stone. Rachel Patterson clutched her surviving son close, her eyes reflecting torchlight like broken glass. "My Emma's dead because of her," Rachel said, pointing at Clara with a shaking finger. "That woman promised she could heal, but all she brought was more death." Clara sank to her knees in the mud she had made with her own vomit. The smell rose around her like a cloud of shame mixing with the stench of her unwashed body and fever-soaked clothes. She had lost control of everything: her patience, the community's trust, her own failing flesh. "Please," Clara whispered the word barely audible above the horses stamping and snorting. "Let me try." "Try what?" Morrison's voice cracked like a whip. "You've had your chance. 4 coffins is enough." Inside the infirmary, Sarah Henderson began to cry. Thin, keening wails that cut through the night air like a rusty saw blade. The 5-year-old called for her mother, but Mary Henderson sat frozen on her horse, torn between defending Clara and protecting her remaining child. Clara crawled through the mud toward the infirmary, her hands and knees squelching in the filth. Somewhere she had lost her dignity along with her strength. But the children inside needed medicine. Sarah Henderson's fever had not broken. Pete Hawkins had stopped responding entirely to her treatments. "Look at her," someone called from the crowd of riders, crawling in the dirt like a snake. Clara's face burned with shame hotter than any fever. These people had trusted her with their most precious possessions: their children, their elderly, their hope for the future. She had failed them all, watching helplessly as patients died despite her desperate efforts. The infirmary door seemed miles away. Each movement forward cost tremendous effort, her arms shaking with exhaustion as she pulled herself through mud that clung to her dress like accusations made solid. Behind her, the voices continued their judgment, listing her failures in precise detail. Morrison Boy dead, Emma Patterson dead, Henrik Larson dead, Dr. Miller burning with fever. 17 patients crammed into space meant for 6, most of them sliding toward death despite her care. William knelt beside her in the mud, his weathered hands gentle on her shoulders. "You didn't kill them," he said. "Didn't save them either." Clara's words came out as gasps between retching fits, her body convulsed with chills despite the fever burning through her blood. She could taste copper where she'd bitten her tongue. The torches cast dancing shadows across the infirmary walls, making the building look like it was already on fire. Inside, patients moaned and called out in delirium, their voices blending into a chorus of suffering that Clara had proven powerless to silence. Marshall Webb appeared at her other side, his badge catching torchlight. "Ma'am, maybe it's time to step aside. Let folks make their own choices about treatment." Clara pressed her face to the mud, feeling grit grind between her teeth. The earth smelled of horse manure and her own failures. A perfect bed for someone who had promised healing, but delivered only death. "Can't," she whispered into the dirt. "Still got patience inside." "Patience you can't help," Morrison said from his horse high above. "Time to admit defeat and let the fever run its course." The crowd began to disperse, families loading their remaining sick into wagons and departing without backward glances. Clara watched them leave through eyes blurred with tears and fever, knowing she had lost their trust forever. The woman who had arrived at the depot with medicine in her bag had become the woman who crawled in mud outside her own infirmary. But as the last torches disappeared into darkness, William helped her struggle to her feet. Inside the infirmary, Sarah Henderson's cries had grown weaker. Pete Hawkins's breathing came in gasps, barely strong enough to flutter a feather. "We're alone now," William said, his arms steady around her trembling shoulders. Clara looked toward the infirmary, where lamplight flickered through windows like dying hope. 13 patients still clung to life inside, though barely. If she gave up now, they would all follow the same path as Emma Patterson and the others. But as she took her first shaking step toward the door, she noticed something that made her blood freeze despite the fever burning through her veins. Fresh hoof prints in the mud, too small and neat to belong to any of the horses that had just departed. Someone else had been watching from the shadows during the confrontation. Someone who rode a different kind of horse entirely, who had stayed hidden while the townspeople delivered their judgment. The same someone who had been poisoning water supplies across 5 valleys, methodically murdering entire communities for reasons Clara could not begin to fathom. They were still out there in the darkness, and now they knew exactly how weak and isolated Brennan Ranch had become. The night passed in a blur of fever and desperate work. Clara forced herself to move between beds, even as her own body tried to shut down. Every breath felt like breathing through wet wool. Every movement sent pain shooting through joints that felt like they were grinding together without lubrication. But she did not stop, could not stop, because somewhere in the deepest part of her soul, she knew that stopping meant death. Not just for her patients, but for herself. The moment she gave up, the moment she admitted defeat, would be the moment her body surrendered to the poison burning through her veins. William worked beside her in silence, bringing water, changing sheets, holding down patients who thrashed in delirium. He moved with quiet efficiency, anticipating her needs before she could speak them. When she stumbled, his hand was there to steady her. When she fell, he lifted her back to her feet and kept her moving. Near 3 in the morning, Clara heard a sound that should not exist. The steady rhythm of a shovel biting into earth. She stumbled to the window and looked out to see William digging by lamplight, his shirt soaked with sweat despite the cool night air. "What are you doing?" she managed to croak. "Knew well," he said without stopping. "Can't trust the old water. Have to go deeper. Find clean source." The implications took a moment to penetrate Clara's fevered mind. If the surface water was poisoned, then going deeper might reach water that had not been contaminated. Might find a source that could save them. How deep as it takes. Clara watched him work, this man who had chosen her from a depot platform when she arrived in rags, who had built an infirmary with bleeding hands, who had stayed beside her through the community's anger and her own failures. His features showed resolve mixed with something deeper. Not just determination, desperation. The same desperation she had seen that first day when he looked at her carpet bag full of medicine. "William," she said, "why did you really choose me?" He stopped digging, rested his weight on the shovel. When he looked up at her, his face was carved in shadows and lamplight, every line and scar visible. "I had a wife," he said. His voice was rough, scraped raw by emotion he had kept buried for years. "And a son. Boy was 7 years old. Took fever one spring." Clara's hands tightened on the windowsill. "I said he'd get better on his own," William continued. "Didn't call the doctor because I thought I knew everything. Thought I was smart enough, strong enough, that my family didn't need outside help." He drove the shovel into the earth with force that spoke of rage turned inward. Next morning, Boy was dead. Wife caught it from him. Week later, I was burying them both. The confession hung in the air between them. Clara understood now, understood why he had chosen the woman with medicine in her bag instead of the beautiful ones in silk. Understood why he trusted her judgment without question. Understood the wound he carried, the guilt that drove him to dig a well at 3 in the morning while his own body screamed for rest. "That day I swore I'd never let anyone die because I was too proud to ask for help," William said. "That's why I chose you, why I believe in you, and why I'm not giving up on these people, even if they've given up on themselves." Clara felt something shift in her chest, a loosening of the despair that had threatened to drown her. She was not alone in her failure, not alone in her guilt. They were both wounded healers trying to save others, to redeem themselves. "Keep digging," she whispered. At 40 feet, the shovel struck water. William hauled bucket after bucket to the surface, testing it with his tongue, his nose, every sense he possessed. The water ran clear as crystal, cold and sweet, untainted by the rot that had poisoned everything else. Clara began giving it to the patients, immediately replacing every drop of the old water with this new clean source. She worked through what remained of the night, forcing herself to stay conscious through sheer force of will. And as dawn broke, something miraculous began to happen. Pete Hawkins sat upright in his bed, his weathered face clear for the first time in a week. His eyes tracked Clara's movement without the fever-bright glaze that had consumed him. "You look like something the cat dragged in," he said, managing a weak smile that cracked his chapped lips. Clara pressed her palm against his forehead. "Cool. Normal." The fever that had burned through him like wildfire had broken completely. "How long was I out?" he asked. "Most of the night." She moved to the next bed, hardly daring to believe what she was seeing. Sarah Henderson lay quiet, her small chest rising and falling in normal rhythm instead of the desperate gasps that had terrified her mother. The child's skin felt warm but not burning. When Clara lifted her eyelids, the pupils focused properly, instead of rolling back to show only whites. One by one, the patients improved. Fevers breaking around midnight like dominoes falling backward. Bodies finally able to fight back now that clean water flowed through their systems instead of poison. Rachel Patterson sat beside another bed, tears streaming down her face as she held her surviving son's hand. The boy who had been calling for his dead father just hours before now squeezed his mother's fingers and asked for a cup of water in a voice that sounded human again. "What happened?" Clara asked, though part of her was afraid to trust what she was seeing. William appeared in the doorway carrying an armload of fresh linens. New well came through around 3 this morning, hit clean water at 40 feet. Been hauling buckets ever since, giving everyone fresh water instead of what we've been drawing from the contaminated source. Clara looked at the water barrels lining the walls, noting how the liquid inside ran clear as crystal, without the faint cloudiness she had grown accustomed to. Clean water. Not just boiled, but drawn from a source untouched by whatever poison had flowed through their valley. 13 patients, William said. 13 recovered. Not one lost after we switched to clean water. The words should have filled Clara with triumph. Instead, she felt only exhaustion and the bitter knowledge of what the victory had cost. "Still lost 4 before that," she said. "Saved 13. William's shoulder touched hers, warm and solid in the morning light. "Without you, we'd have lost them all." The morning brought more evidence of recovery. Families began returning to the ranch, not with anger this time, but with shame and gratitude mixed together. They came quietly, hats in hands, unable to meet Clara's eyes as they apologized for their words the night before. Banker Morrison was among them, his pressed suit wrinkled from a sleepless night. "Miss Clara," he said, his voice breaking, "we were wrong to turn on you. Wrong to blame you for doing what none of us had the courage to attempt." Clara tried to speak and found her voice had returned along with her patient's health, though it remained hoarse and painful. "You were scared," she said. "People do foolish things when they're scared." "No excuse for it," Morrison replied. "You kept trying even when we gave up hope. Kept working even when you were sick yourself. Takes a special kind of courage to do that." But even as the community offered its apologies, even as patients sat up in bed sharing quiet conversations, Clara noticed something that made her uneasy. Theodore Morrison kept glancing toward the road, checking his pocket watch, waiting for something or someone who had not yet arrived. And when a well-dressed stranger rode into the ranch yard that afternoon, Clara saw a recognition flash across Morrison's face. Saw him stiffen, then force himself to relax. Saw him touch his hat brim in a greeting that was almost a salute. The stranger dismounted with the easy grace of a man comfortable in the saddle. His suit was too fine for ranch country, his boots too polished, his horse too expensive. Everything about him screamed outsider, yet he moved with the confidence of someone who belonged wherever he chose to be. "Silas Hartwell," he said, removing his hat. "Eastern Mining Consortium. I'm here surveying investment opportunities in the region." He smiled, but the expression never reached his eyes. Those remained cold, calculating, measuring Clara and William and the ranch with the detachment of a man appraising livestock. "Terrible situation with the sickness," Hartwell continued. "Such a shame." William received him coolly in the parlor. Clara served coffee, establishing her presence, making it clear she would not be dismissed or ignored. She watched Hartwell's every movement, cataloging details. The way he checked his pocket watch frequently. The way his gaze lingered on her carpet bag with odd interest. The way he asked questions about the valley's population that seemed innocent on the surface but felt wrong underneath. "You're the healer everyone talks about," Hartwell said to Clara. "Quite remarkable what you've accomplished." "Just doing what needed to be done," Clara replied. "Of course." Hartwell sipped his coffee with the pinky finger slightly extended, a mark of refinement that felt performative. Still tragic about the ones who died. Emma Patterson wasn't it. And the Morrison boy, and old Henrik Larson. The fact that he knew their names sent a chill down Clara's spine. This man had just arrived, yet he could recite the valley's dead-like reading from a ledger. "We represent Eastern Mining Consortium," Hartwell said, setting down his cup. "We're assessing the valley's viability for future development." Clara caught the word. Viability. Not suitability, not potential. Viability. As if the valley itself needed to prove it deserved to exist. Viability for what she asked. Hartwell's smile widened, still not reaching his eyes. Future development. Mining operations. Once the current difficulties resolved themselves, of course, there it was. Once difficulties resolved themselves, as if the epidemic was weather that would pass, as if the deaths of children were merely inconveniences to be waited out. Through the window, Clara saw Morrison approach Hartwell's horse, saw him glance around to make sure no one was watching, saw him tuck a sealed envelope into the saddlebag with movements that spoke of long practice. Her blood turned to ice. Morrison was working with this man, had been all along. The banker who held the valley's financial future in his hands was in league with Eastern Mining Consortium. And if Webb's map was correct, if someone was systematically poisoning water supplies across multiple valleys, then Morrison was not just a collaborator. He was an accomplice to mass murder. Clara said nothing to William about what she had seen. Not yet. Not until she had more proof than a glimpse through a window and the cold certainty settling in her bones like winter frost. But she watched Morrison carefully for the rest of the day, noting how he avoided meeting anyone's eyes, how his hands trembled when he poured himself coffee, how he kept glancing toward the road as if expecting judgment to arrive on horseback. Marshall Webb returned that evening with dirt under his fingernails and exhaustion written across every line of his weathered face. He had spent the day examining upstream water sources, collecting evidence, piecing together the pattern of deliberate contamination that had killed 23 people across 5 valleys. Found the bastard's operation, Webb said, spreading new maps across the kitchen table. Dead animals placed at precise intervals, all branded. Someone wanted us to trace them back to the source. Who, William asked. That's what we're about to find out. Webb looked toward the window where dusk was gathering like smoke. Got word Morrison's had been making trips to the territorial office in Sweetwater, filing claims, transferring property rights. All very legal and proper. For Eastern Mining Consortium, Clara asked. Webb's silence was answer enough. They waited until full dark before making their move. Webb positioned his deputies at strategic points around Millfield. One at the telegraph office, one at the bank, 2 watching the roads out of town. The trap was set. All they needed was for Morrison to walk into it. The banker arrived at his office just after 8, lamplight visible through the windows as he worked late into the evening. Clara watched from across the street, hidden in shadows, her heart pounding against her ribs. This was it. The moment when they would finally get answers about who was behind the poisonings and why. But Morrison was not alone. Silas Hartwell materialized from the darkness like a ghost, his expensive horse moving silent as death across the packed earth street. He dismounted and slipped inside the bank through the back entrance, his movements practiced efficient, the actions of a man who had done this many times before. Now, Webb whispered. They moved in fast, deputies converging from multiple directions. Webb kicked open the bank's front door, hand on his gun badge, catching lamplight. Theodore Morrison, you're under arrest for conspiracy to commit murder and accessory to mass poisoning. Morrison's face drained white as bone. He stood behind his desk, one hand frozen in the act of handing documents to Hartwell, the other reaching for a gun that Webb's deputies would never let him touch. I didn't know, Morrison said, his voice cracking like thin ice. I swear to God, I didn't know what he was doing. Hartwell remained perfectly still, his cold blue eyes assessing the situation with the detachment of a gambler calculating odds. 3 armed deputies, Webb with his hand on his gun, William blocking the back door, no escape route visible. These are serious accusations, Marshal Hartwell said, his voice smooth as silk over steel. I'm here representing legitimate business interests. Whatever Mr. Morrison has been doing is his own affair. That's so. Webb pulled a sealed envelope from his coat. Then you won't mind explaining why your signature is on documents authorizing water contamination across 12 territorial valleys. For the first time, something flickered in Hartwell's eyes. Not fear, not panic, but calculation. The cold assessment of a man realizing his carefully laid plans had encountered an unexpected obstacle. Morrison's hands were shaking so badly he could barely hold the documents he had been about to hand over. Suddenly, a gunshot cracked through the night air, but not from inside the bank, from the direction of Brennan Ranch. The barn, someone shouted from outside. Fire at the Brennan place. Webb's head whipped around, torn between the arrest and the emergency. In that fraction of a second's distraction, Hartwell moved. Not toward a weapon, not toward violence, toward the back door, with the speed of a man who had spent his life calculating exits and opportunities. William tried to block him, but Hartwell was already moving, already through the door, already mounting his horse with practiced grace. The animal sprang forward before William could grab the reins, disappearing into darkness, while deputies shouted and Webb cursed and Morrison collapsed to his knees on the bank floor. I didn't know, the banker wept. I swear I didn't know he was killing people. He said it was just geological surveys. Said he needed water source data for mining assessments. I thought I was helping the territory grow. Thought I was securing our financial future. While you secured your own pockets, Webb said coldly. They left 2 deputies to guard Morrison and rode hard for Brennan Ranch. The fire was real enough. The barn burned bright against the night sky, flames leaping toward the stars like desperate prayers. But it was also a distraction, Clara to realize as they galloped through darkness. Hartwell had set it to split their forces to create chaos to buy himself time to escape. Pete Hawkins and the other recovered patients were already fighting the flames when they arrived, passing buckets in a line from the well to the burning structure. The horses had been saved, led to safety in the corrals. No lives lost, just property damage that could be rebuilt. But while they fought the fire, Hartwell was getting away. Dawn came cold and gray, promising rain that would not fall. Clara stood in the ruins of the barn, exhausted beyond measure. Her hands blistered from handling bucket after bucket of water through the long night. The fire was out. The damage was extensive but not catastrophic. They had been lucky. We can't let him get away, William said. His face was black with soot, his eyes red from smoke. Webb stood nearby, studying hoof prints in the mud. Fresh tracks leading north into canyon country, where a man on a good horse could disappear for weeks. He knows we have evidence, Webb said. Knows Morrison's in custody, knows his whole operation is compromised. He's desperate now, and a desperate man is the most dangerous kind. Then we hunt him down, William said. Clara looked between them, seeing the determination in their faces, the anger that demanded justice. But she also saw the risk. Hartwell was not just dangerous because he was desperate. He was dangerous because he represented something larger than himself. Eastern Mining Consortium. Corporate interests that measured human lives in dollars and mining rights. Forces that could hire lawyers and buy politicians and make evidence disappear. I'm coming with you, she said. William started to object, but Clara cut him off with a look that brooked no argument. He's been poisoning my patients, she said. Killing children I tried to save. I've earned the right to see him face justice. The tracking party rode out an hour later. Webb, William, Clara, Pete Hawkins, and 2 deputies. 6 people against 1 man, but that 1 man had proven himself ruthless, intelligent, and willing to kill on a scale that beggared imagination. The trail led north into broken country where red stone cliffs rose like cathedral walls and ravens circled on thermals, their harsh cries echoing off canyon walls. Hartwell's tracks were easy to follow at first, his horse moving fast, not bothering to hide his passage. But as the day wore on and the canyon narrowed, the signs became more subtle. He knows we're following, Webb said, studying disturbed stones that might have been a horse's passage or might have been natural erosion. The canyon walls pressed close on either side, rising hundreds of feet above them, cutting off the sun and creating permanent twilight. Water had carved this place over millennia, shaping stone into fantastic formations that looked like frozen waterfalls or melted candles. Beautiful and treacherous in equal measure. Perfect ambush country, Pete Hawkins said quietly. The words had barely left his mouth when a rifle shot cracked from above. William's horse screamed and went down, blood blooming from its chest. William kicked free of the stirrups and rolled, coming up behind the dying animal for cover, while bullets spanged off stone around him. Webb returned fire, his rifle barking 3 times in quick succession. The shots echoed between canyon walls, multiplying until it sounded like a whole company was engaged in battle. Clara pressed herself against the cliff face, her heart hammering, useless in this violence, but unable to look away. Hartwell's voice floated down from the heights, distorted by echoes, but still carrying that cold certainty. You think stopping me stops anything? Eastern Mining Consortium has 12 valleys targeted. I'm one of 6 field agents. Even if you take me, the others continue the work. The revelation hit Clara like a physical blow. Not just 1 man, not just 1 valley. 6 agents systematically poisoning 12 communities across hundreds of square miles of territory. The scope of it was staggering, the evil almost incomprehensible in its calculated efficiency. Come down and face justice, Webb shouted. Just as Hartwell laughed, the sound bouncing off stone walls until it seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. We have lawyers, politicians, judges, in our pockets. Who do you think will believe a mail-order bride and a rancher over documented business interests? Pete Hawkins had been moving during this exchange, climbing the cliff face with the agility of a man who had spent decades working in rough country. Clara watched him disappear into shadows, working his way toward Hartwell's position with quiet determination. Another shot rang out, this one closer, and Clara heard the whistle of the bullet passing near her head. She pressed herself flatter against stone-tasting dust in fear in equal measure. This was not healing. This was the violence she had spent her life trying to prevent. But sometimes she realized you had to confront evil directly before you could heal the wounds it left behind. Pete appeared above Hartwell's position, silhouetted against the sky for just a moment before he launched himself downward. The two men crashed together, rolling, struggling, tumbling down the rocky slope in a tangle of limbs and curses. Hartwell's rifle clattered away. Pete's leg twisted at an impossible angle with a crack that made Clara's stomach turn. They hit the canyon floor hard, both men stunned. Webb and William converged immediately, guns drawn surrounding Hartwell, before he could recover enough to run. "It's over," Webb said, snapping iron manacles around Hartwell's wrists. Hartwell looked up at them from where he lay in the dust, his fine suit torn and dirty, his cold eyes still calculating even in defeat. "Nothing's over," he said. "You've delayed us by a few months at most. The valleys will be cleared. The mining rights will be secured. Progress demands it." Clara stepped forward, looking down at this man who had orchestrated the deaths of children for profit, who had turned water into poison, who had measured human lives against ore deposits and found them wanting. "Progress," she said quietly, "doesn't demand the murder of innocents. That's just what evil men call their greed to make themselves feel better about it." Something flickered in Hartwell's eyes then. Not shame, not remorse, but perhaps the faintest recognition that his justifications sounded hollow when spoken aloud to a woman who had spent nights holding dying children in her arms. They bound him securely and started the long ride back to Millfield, taking turns supporting Pete Hawkins, whose broken leg would need setting. The old cowhand bore the pain with stoic silence, only his white-knuckled grip on the saddle horn betraying his suffering. "We got him," William said to Clara as they rode. "But at what cost?" she replied, looking at Pete, at William's dead horse being left for the scavengers, at the violence they had been forced to commit in the name of justice. "The cost of letting him go free would have been higher," William said. Clara knew he was right. But the knowledge did not make her feel any better about what they had done, what they had become in the pursuit of stopping Hartwell. Violence, even in the name of justice, left stains on the soul. They arrived back at Brennan Ranch near sunset, bone-tired and covered in trail dust. A crowd had gathered in the yard, families from across the valley, drawn by word that the poisoner had been caught. Marshal Webb's deputies took custody of Hartwell, locking him in the reinforced room they used for prisoners awaiting transport to territorial courts. Morrison was already there, huddled in the corner, unable to meet anyone's eyes. When Hartwell entered, the banker looked up with an expression of mingled relief and terror. "Tell them," Morrison said. "Tell them I didn't know. Tell them you lied to me." Hartwell said nothing, just looked at Morrison with contempt before settling himself on the hard bench as if it were a throne. The next morning brought revelations that spread through the valley like wildfire. Webb had spent the night going through the documents seized from Morrison's bank. The evidence was damning and comprehensive. 12 valleys marked for clearing. Systematic contamination authorized by Eastern Mining Consortium. Payment schedules showing Morrison had received substantial sums for providing water source maps and population data. But there was more. Letters from other field agents reporting on their progress. Casualty estimates treated as routine business metrics. Profit projections that factored in the cost of clearing settlements against the value of mineral rights to be gained. Clara read through the documents with growing horror, seeing the cold calculation behind what she had experienced as human tragedy. Emma Patterson was not a child in these papers. She was an acceptable loss, a statistic, a minor cost of doing business. Families began arriving at the ranch again, but this time not with sick children or desperate pleas for help. They came to express gratitude, to apologize for their doubt, to acknowledge that Clara had fought for them when they had turned against her. Mary Henderson brought both her children, Tommy and Sarah, healthy and bright-eyed. She carried a quilt she had been working on through the long nights of worry. "Made this for you," Mary said, pressing it into Clara's hands. "Every stitch is a prayer of thanks." The quilt was beautiful, carefully pieced together from scraps of fabric that told the valley's story. blue calico like Clara's dress, brown cotton from work shirts, white muslin from children's nightgowns, a patchwork of lives woven together by a mother's gratitude. Rachel Patterson came too, her surviving son clinging to her skirts. The woman who had led the mob against Clara now stood before her with tears streaming down her face. I blamed you for Emma's death, Rachel said. Said terrible things, watched you crawl in the mud, and felt satisfied. But you were fighting for our children while I gave up hope. Emma died because of poison, Clara said gently. Not because I wasn't good enough. I know that now. Rachel's voice broke. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. Clara embraced her, feeling the woman's body shake with sobs. They had both lost someone they loved. Both carried guilt for things beyond their control. In their shared grief, they found a kind of peace. Other families came forward with their own apologies. Preacher Williams admitted his harsh judgment had been wrong. The riders who had surrounded the infirmary with torches now offered to help rebuild the burned barn. Even banker Morrison from his cell sent word begging forgiveness for his role in the tragedy. The valley was healing, not just from the poison in the water, but from the poison of distrust and fear that had turned neighbor against neighbor. That evening, as the sun painted the western sky in shades of gold and crimson, Clara walked to the ancient oak tree that dominated the ranch yard. Its trunk measured 6 feet across, scarred by lightning strikes, but still standing strong after decades of frontier storms. The bark felt rough under her palm, solid and enduring in ways that human settlements rarely achieved. William followed without words, understanding that some moments required the quiet strength of growing things. The evening air carried the scent of wild roses and prairie grass, sweetened by the promise of rain that might finally come to wash away the dust and ash. I came here with nothing but herbs and hope. In an old carpet bag, Clara said, her fingers tracing lightning scars in the oak's bark. And built something that'll outlast both of us, William replied. Clara turned to face him, noting how the evening light softened the hard lines carved by years of sun and wind without hiding the strength there. This man had seen her at her absolute worst, crawling through mud, vomiting from fever, cursing her own inadequacy. But he had also watched her refuse to quit when any reasonable person would have walked away. If we do this together, she said, help other valleys fight the poisoning. It won't be easy. More sick children, more families torn apart, more nights wondering if our efforts matter against such calculated evil. William took her work, roughened hands in his own calloused palms, his grip steady as stone foundations. Figured that out when I saw you open that carpet bag on the depot platform, he said. You were never going to be the kind of woman who sits safe while others suffer around her. Normal sounds returned to the valley as they stood beneath the oak. Cattle lowing in distant pastures, owls calling from cottonwood groves, the soft murmur of families sharing evening meals together. Sounds that had been absent during the epidemic's worst days now restored like a symphony of ordinary miracles. Marry me, William said, his voice carrying the certainty of a man who had found his purpose. Not just as my wife, but as my partner in all this. We'll take what we learned here and use it to save other communities. Make sure no more children die for mining rights. Clara looked up through the oak's spreading branches at stars scattered like grain across the night sky. Somewhere out there, other families faced the same deliberate poisoning that had nearly destroyed their valley. Children were losing parents. Parents were losing children. All so distant, men could claim mineral wealth from cleared land. But here under this lightning-scarred tree stood proof that such calculated cruelty could be defeated. Not through violence or revenge, but through the simple refusal to let people die when they could be saved. Yes, Clara said, the word carrying weight beyond marriage vows. William's arms came around her, solid and warm in the cooling night air. Over his shoulder, Clara could see the infirmary they had built together. Empty now, but ready to serve again when needed, they had proven something important in this valley, something worth carrying to every threatened community across the territory. The oak tree's branches rustled overhead in the prairie breeze, and Clara realized they were making a promise not just to each other, but to every family still facing poisoned water and calculated murder. They would take their hard-earned knowledge from valley to valley, one community at a time, until the men responsible faced justice for their crimes. Under the ancient oak with moonlight painting everything silver, Clara felt something settle in her chest. Not just love, though that was there growing like the oak itself slowly and surely, but purpose. The kind of clarity that comes from knowing exactly what you are meant to do with your life, even when that path leads through danger and heartbreak. Tomorrow, Marshal Webb would begin the process of transporting Hartwell and Morrison to territorial courts. Other marshals were already moving to arrest the remaining field agents. Federal investigators were examining Eastern Mining Consortium's operations across multiple territories. The machinery of justice was slow, but it was moving. But justice from distant courts would take months, maybe years. The 11 other valleys marked for clearing could not wait that long. They needed help now. Needed someone who understood what they faced. Someone who had fought this battle before and knew how to win. They needed Clara and William. The next morning dawned clear and bright, the kind of day that promised new beginnings. Clara woke early, her body finally beginning to recover from the fever that had nearly claimed her. She moved through the ranch house, noting how empty it felt, how quiet. The desperate urgency of the past weeks had given way to peaceful normalcy, but that normalcy would not last. Could not last. Not while other valleys suffered. William was already loading the wagon when she stepped onto the porch. Medical supplies, clean water testing equipment Webb had given them, camping gear for rough travel, provisions for weeks on the road. He worked with quiet efficiency, anticipating her needs before she could voice them. Marshal Webb arrived on horseback just as the sun cleared the eastern mountains. Got word from Cottonwood Creek, he said without preamble. They started taking sick 3 days ago. Same pattern, same symptoms. They've got maybe 5 days before the poisoning gets too advanced to treat. How far, Clara asked. 2 days hard riding. Webb's weathered face showed respect mixed with concern. I've sent word you're coming, but Clara, you just recovered yourself. You sure you're strong enough for this? Clara thought about Emma Patterson singing to her doll before she died. About Tommy Henderson asking if she was an angel. About Sarah Henderson's small arms wrapped around her neck in gratitude. About the 13 lives saved because someone refused to quit. I'm strong enough, she said. Families began gathering in the yard, drawn by word that Clara and William were leaving. They came not to say goodbye, but to send them off with blessings and provisions. Mary Henderson brought food enough for an army. Pete Hawkins, his legs splinted, but healing, volunteered to ride with them despite his injury. You saved my life, he said. Let me help save others. Rosa Delgado, the ranch's cook who had provided herbal knowledge throughout the crisis, also stepped forward. I know the plants of this country, she said in Spanish, accented English. Know what heals and what harms. You will need this knowledge in other valleys. Dr. Miller appeared in his buggy, looking aged beyond his years, but with fire still burning in his eyes. He carried an armload of medical books, leather-bound volumes representing decades of accumulated knowledge. Too old to ride with you, he said, pressing them into Clara's hands. But these will serve you better than they served me, gathering dust on my shelves. Rachel Patterson was the last to approach. She carried the quilt with Emma's name embroidered across it, the one she had shown Clara days before. So you remember why this matters? Rachel said, her voice steady despite the tears streaming down her face. Clara accepted the quilt, feeling its weight like a sacred trust. I won't let her be forgotten, she promised. The wagon stood ready, packed with everything they would need for the journey ahead. William checked the harness one final time, while Clara placed her father's medical bag in the seat beside her. The same worn carpet bag that had caused William to choose her from the depot platform all those weeks ago. We can stay, Clara said quietly to William. You've got a ranch to run, responsibilities here, a life you built long before I arrived. William looked back at his land at the house with its wraparound porch and wild roses at the corrals and pastures that represented decades of hard work, leaving prosperity and comfort for a dangerous, uncertain road. Clara saw the hesitation in his eyes, the natural reluctance to abandon everything he had built. Then he turned to her and the hesitation vanished. Ranch will be here when we get back, he said. Those children in Cottonwood Creek won't wait. Besides, home isn't a place anymore. It's wherever you are. The words settled over Clara like a blessing. She climbed into the wagon, her hand resting on the carpet bag beside her. Still worn, still patched, but no longer a symbol of poverty and desperation. Now it represented something greater. Hope, healing, the stubborn refusal to let evil triumph without a fight. Pete Hawkins and Rosa Delgado mounted their horses, ready to ride alongside the wagon. Marshal Webb would accompany them as far as the valley border, before returning to transport Hartwell and Morrison to face justice. The small convoys started down the road, wagon wheels crunching gravel, morning sun warming their backs. Behind them, the community they had saved gathered to watch them go. Ahead, 2 days of hard riding, followed by another valley full of dying children. Another community desperate for hope. Clara looked back one last time at Brennan Ranch, at the oak tree where William had proposed, at the rebuilt infirmary standing ready for when they returned, at the people waving farewell, their faces showing gratitude and sorrow mixed together. Then she faced forward toward the mountains rising purple in the distance, toward the work that awaited them, toward the purpose that would define the rest of her life. They say the West is a hard place for dreamers, Clara thought. That only the strong survive, only the rich prosper. But I've learned something different. She had learned that true strength was not measured in acres or cattle or bank accounts. It was measured in the willingness to keep helping when everything seemed hopeless, in the refusal to quit when quitting would be easier, in choosing the hard right over the easy wrong again and again until it became the only choice you knew how to make. William asked me on that first day why I wanted to help people, Clara remembered. I never got to answer before Tommy took sick, but now she knew the answer, could speak it aloud if anyone asked. She helped because every life mattered, because children should not die for mining rights, because love was stronger than greed and healing more powerful than harm, and because sometimes the woman in the raggedy dress was exactly the hero the world needed. The wagon rolled on through prairie grass that whispered in the wind. Ahead, somewhere beyond the mountains, a community was dying. Families were watching their children burn with fever. Mothers were praying for miracles that might not come. But Clara Hayes Brennan was coming, and she would not quit, would not surrender, would not accept that profit mattered more than people or that progress required the sacrifice of innocence. She carried her father's instruments and her grandmother's knowledge. She carried William's unwavering support and the community's trust hard-won through trial and suffering. She carried Emma Patterson's memory and Tommy Henderson's gratitude and the debt she owed to all those who had believed in her when she could barely believe in herself. Most of all, she carried hope, the stubborn, irrational, essential belief that one person could make a difference, that healing was possible even in the darkest circumstances, that love and determination and refusal to quit could overcome evil no matter how vast and well organized. The mountains rose ahead, beautiful and impassable looking, but there were passes through them, trails known to those who took the time to search. Just as there were solutions to poisoned water and answers to corporate greed and paths through every crisis if you refused to give up looking. 2 days to Cottonwood Creek, then 11 more valleys after that. Months of hard work, years maybe, a lifetime spent riding from community to community, teaching them to dig deep wells and test their water and recognize the signs of deliberate poisoning. A lifetime spent proving that the value of a person was not measured by what they owned, but by what they did when they had nothing left to lose. Clara's hand rested on her worn carpetbag as the wagon carried them toward the mountains. The sun climbed higher, burning off the morning cool and promising another scorching day. But she did not mind the heat, did not mind the hard road ahead or the uncertainty of what they would find, because she was no longer the desperate woman who had stepped off the train in her patched dress, hoping someone would see past her poverty to the skills she carried. She was the healer who had saved 13 lives, the woman who had crawled through mud and kept fighting, the partner of a man who saw her worth before anyone else did. She was exactly where she belonged, doing exactly what she was meant to do. And she would not stop until every valley was safe, every child protected, every family given the chance to build their future without fear of poison in their water and greed in the hearts of distant men. The wagon disappeared over the first hill, carrying its cargo of medicine and hope toward the next battle. Behind them, the oak tree stood sentinel over Brennan Ranch, its lightning-scarred trunk proof that survival was possible, that damage could be endured, that life continued even after the worst storms. Ahead, the mountains waited, and beyond them, families who did not yet know that help was coming, that the woman in rags had become their salvation, that tomorrow might be better than today because someone refused to let them die alone and forgotten. Clara Hayes Brennan rode toward her destiny with her head high and her heart full and her hands ready to heal. Sometimes the most precious gifts come wrapped in the plainest paper, and sometimes those gifts save the world.